Perfecto, muchísimas gracias. Pues bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Hola a todos y todos que están viéndonos por YouTube o por Blue Jeans. Yo soy Benjamín Bruce, profesor investigador del Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Hoy tenemos el gran placer de escuchar la ponencia del doctor Oğuz Alyanak de la Fundación Fair Work, vinculado con la Universidad de Oxford y la Technische Universität Berlin. Esta sesión va a ser en idioma inglés, entonces voy a cambiar ahora a inglés, pero si tienen alguna pregunta en español, no hay ningún problema para escribirlo en el chat de YouTube o preguntar aquí en Blue Jeans igual y podemos traducir. So once again, welcome to everyone and to our guest today, Dr. Oğuz Alyanak from the Fair Work Foundation, University of Oxford, and Technical University Berlin, Technische Universität Berlin, based in Berlin right now. So it's evening for him right now. I think right now we'll just have a quick overview of Dr. Alyanak, who has finished PhD work all over Europe and the United States and has since moved from Washington State,
St. Louis in Missouri.
St. Louis in Missouri, where he's working with Dr. John Bowen, to now move on to a Volkswagen postdoc, first with the University of Göttingen, and now working with the Fair Work Foundation based in Berlin. And so he will talk to us today, in particular, about some of the methodology that he has used in his work, including the idea of shadowing. So how best to be in contact with the people who one is doing research on, and of course something which is very interesting for our current project on undocumented migrants in the United States. So Dr. Alyanak, if you wish, presentation, and then we will have questions and discussion following the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Thanks once again for inviting me for this fantastic opportunity. This, as we were chatting just a few minutes ago, brings me back to 2016-18, the time when I did most of the research, and brings me back to Strasbourg, France, right at the border of Germany, where I did the research with Turkish immigrants living in Strasbourg. And it's been a while that I've been back to Strasbourg. I guess we all know the reason, that being COVID. I was supposed to be back in Strasbourg last year when I was in Göttingen, but that couldn't happen, sadly. And I am in the process of moving on to a new project on workers' health and working conditions mostly, which has partially to do with the research that I've done in Strasbourg, some of the findings that I got in there. And I'm also in the meantime in the process of publishing from the previous research, including a manuscript that I'm working on to turn this research and the findings into a book. In what format, I do not know. To what extent is it going to be an academic one, I do not know. There are many questions that still wait to be answered, but these are opportunities that I cherish a lot because they actually help me to rethink what I've done and how to best present it to larger audiences. So I have a quick PowerPoint presentation to basically walk us through what I've done in Strasbourg in France and in Germany right across the border, but also from there to show how the methodology that I used, partially shadowing, basically methodology on the move, as I like to call it, has helped me to collect data and to better understand the lives of people that I've studied. So I'm going to share my screen now. And all right, here we go. Here's the presentation for today. And if in case anyone has any questions, I do not see the screen while I'm doing the presentation, do please cut me and then let me know if there are any questions, anything that needs to be explained further. And then after this short presentation, we can have an open discussion about how methodology can be used to collect data, but also how the research questions that we ask shape the kind of methodology that we use in our research. So today's lecture is titled Research Methods on the Move, Studying Male Leisure and Nightlives. And it's going to be as I said, mostly a methodology-oriented presentation, but I would like to start a little bit by contextualizing what I've done in Strasbourg back in 2016. So it honestly all started not in 2016, but 2013, when I was doing a pilot project, a pilot research in Strasbourg. This was basically my first summer of graduate studies, and I was sent to France, to Strasbourg. I mean, I wanted to be there, but I was also asked to see just what my eyes see when I'm there. I had these questions of, so the question that really brought me to Strasbourg, to France, was a new Muslim cemetery that opened in Strasbourg, which is a rare case in the context of France, because it's not easy to find Muslim-only cemeteries in a secular country like France, as opposed to its neighbor Germany. So in 2013, I went there to study this cemetery, and I went there with the question of where do people want to be buried when they die? That was the question. It had nothing to do with what what we're gonna be talking about today, because after a couple of days, maybe a week, I realized that this wasn't the question that I want to study. And it all had to do with an encounter, basically. Back in, this, we were talking about 10 years ago, I was walking to a mosque, one of the biggest mosques in Strasbourg, owned by Milli Görüş. And basically what I did was to find where they are at through Google, and then just took the bus and started walking there. And on my way, as I'm walking, getting lost, is it the first right, the second right? I don't know where to, which route to take, really, other than what my phone is telling me. I saw this elderly woman walking in front of me. She exited the bus with me as she started walking. And I was like, let me ask her where this mosque is, because she probably knows it better than I do. She looks like she may be Turkish. There are a lot of Turks in Strasbourg, so why not? So I went there. I don't speak much French back then. I don't think she spoke much French either. I basically just went right in Turkish and said, Selamun Aleyküm, older sister. Could I maybe help you carry those bags? You seem to be having a problem with them. And she gave me a bad look, like, who the hell is he? It was weird. Like, why would anyone just out of the blue just go and offer help? And I said, okay, yeah, I explained, I'm from Turkey. This is who I am. I'm a researcher. I'm doing my PhD in the US. And I don't really know what it's that I want to study. I know what I'm going to. I'm going to this mosque. But I'm interested in studying migrant Turks, and I had an idea that I want to study mostly men, because I would have better access to them. And I said, men like your husband, I guess, for example. That's what I asked her, and she just looked at me. She wasn't pleased with what I said, and I didn't think that what I said had anything wrong, was anything wrong. And she just blasted at me. She said, "You want to know where he is? Go to the coffee houses, go to the slot machines in Germany. That's where he is." Kel is the German border, the neighbor of Strasbourg. Kel, that's the city that stole my husband from me. Hadi, take it easy. So this was back in 2013. That was the answer that I got. And I was like, okay, what the hell has just happened? This doesn't make any sense. I just asked a question. I'm going to this mosque. I'm interested in studying men. I'm interested in studying lives, nothing concrete yet. I didn't mention anything about the cemetery, because the cemetery, all the questions about the cemetery, I was going to the mosque to ask for. And then that was it. So I went to the mosque, but that question, her response kind of lingered through. And then came the second one. So I continued on trying to find where I could encounter Turks, so I could talk to them about, where do you want to die? If you die, where do you want to get buried? Questions that no one really wanted to answer. People didn't want to talk about dying. They didn't want to think about where their body is going to be located when they die. They didn't want to think about if it's going to be dispatched back to Turkey, back to their home country, back to their home villages. They said, no, let's stop. Let's not talk about dying. Let's show you what life is all about. So I said, okay, fine, this is pilot research. I was told to just open my eyes and ears fully and try to grab as much as possible to see what I should study. And they just basically put me in their cars, these men that I met in mosques, sometimes in coffee houses, places where I could find, homosocial places mostly, where I could find Turkish men. And they basically put me in their cars and started taking me around. Where to we had no idea. I don't even think that they had any idea. But oftentimes these drives took us across the border to Germany. And what for? This could be just to eat a nice kebab, for example, which they said that they couldn't find in Strasbourg, but had better opportunities right across the border in the other town. Sometimes we just like drove around aimlessly on the highways and the autobahns of Germany, going nowhere. Sometimes we found a stop in a mosque, grabbed a cup of tea. Sometimes we found a stop in a casino, grabbed a cup of coffee. And they just were telling me, this is where you find us. These are kinds of places that people go to. People just get in their cars and just disappear. So that, and this is a quotation that I copied and pasted from my dissertation that I liked, that the automobile was, I felt, was such a huge force taking us around, taking me around as a researcher, that these men, when they were in their car, they were imbued with an ability to simply disappear. And in a borderland, the possibilities as to where one can disappear are almost endless. So this was what I was starting to realize as I was doing my how long was it? Almost 2 months long pilot research back in 2013. When I want to sit down in a mosque, in a coffee house, in a shop, wherever I could find a Turk, to talk to them about the cemetery. And I went to the cemetery as well. Like I was walking around it, trying to make sense of it in this pilot phase of research. When I sat down to talk with them, they weren't really interested. They were interested in talking more about living, of life itself, and leisure particularly. So here is the map. And I want to show you the map because I, first of all, like to use maps as a tool to show movement, but also for us to get a sense of the lived space, where do people live, and of the border that plays such an important role in this lived environment. So on my left is Strasbourg, to the west, and across the Rhine River starts Germany, where you see Kiel. And these were the two big cities. Strasbourg is a lot bigger than Kiel. Kiel is around 50,000. Strasbourg is around 400,000 people in the city center. So we're talking about two cities that are juxtaposed to each other. But life keeps on moving back and forth between these two cities, especially from the French side to the German side, for various reasons. And these movements are not limited to Kiel. I had to cut the map to fit it to the screen, but if you continue on going east, you end up getting to Mannheim, to Offenburg, to Karlsruhe, to cities that are 2-3 hours away sometimes by car, that my interlocutors still put me in their cars and took me to. So that was interesting to me, that life was always on the move. These nightlives, if you want to put it that way, were always in the car, going from one place to another, and never sedentary, never seated, never in a single space. Sometimes we ended up in a space and we sat down. This could be a shisha bar, this could be a coffee house, this could be a mosque, this could be a bar, this could be a nightclub, a brothel, you name it, a number of different institutions, number of different places. But we ended up hopping from one place to another as we were continuing on with the night. So this was all preliminary research that opened my eyes. And when I got back from preliminary research, I realized that there were new themes that were appearing in front of me. So I went there to study death and dying. I went there to study cemetery, a Muslim cemetery that opened up in Strasbourg. But I came up with a complete different notion of what I should be studying. So the big overarching theme was, of course, labor migration to France. The people that I was looking at were either immigrants that had immigrated from Turkey to France, or young men that are born to second and third generation men that are born to parents that have immigrated from Turkey back in the day, starting from the late 60s up until today, basically. So that was the overarching theme. But when I was doing the preliminary research, I realized that the border played such an important role. Physically, of course, because the moment you cross the border, you're moving from one land to another, you're moving from one jurisdiction to another, you're moving from a place where gambling, on-table gambling, for example, is not allowed, that is France, to Germany, where in each corner you might be finding what they call in German Spielotheks, which are basically gambling alleys, small gambling alleys or betting alleys that you can find. Same goes for things like prostitution, for example, which is illegal in France, but legal in Germany. But same also goes for eating a nice doner kebab, where, in Strasbourg, my interlocutors thought that, opportunities were limited as compared to Germany. This also has to do with the migration background of the two contexts. Of course, in Germany, we're talking about almost 3-4 million, according to some estimates, Turks that are living, whereas in France, we're talking about 1 million, and a longer history, a longer span of Turkish life in these two different, in Germany. So there was the physical movement that was happening across the border, but and this was an idea that came a lot later as I was thinking about the data that I collected. But the movement was not just Cartesian, right? The movement was not just from point A to point B, but also moral. The boundary, the border that was crossed was not just physical, but also moral. That became sort of the central theme of the dissertation that I wrote based on this research. And of course, we are looking at men's lives, leisure lives, things that they do for fun. So in the last 10-15 years, there's been increasing literature produced under the spectrum of anthropology of the night. So that became a rubric to think about the research that I'm doing. But anthropology of the night and anthropology of leisure vis-a-vis morality and Islam. And I will get to that in a second, because that's what made this question interesting and more complex. It's not just people just want to go out. People want to go out, but at what cost? At what moral cost? At what restrictions and limitations? And masculinity as the final bigger theme that I want to intersect all of these conversations with. Masculinity in the sense that men vis-a-vis women within the context of Turks and Turkey are always expected to be more free, right? In terms of their going out, accountability, the repercussions of men doing wrong, morally speaking, is a lot less than women. Things are changing, of course, but there's still this cultural baggage that shapes men's and women's leisure. But I want to also sort of like not contradict that, but to put it to test and see, are men really as free as we think that they are when it comes to movement, when it comes to moral transgressions, for example, which is a huge part of masculinity, and the literature of masculinity talks about that as well. So these were the themes that I intersected all together as, based on the data that I collected, but some of the data that I collected was already being shaped by some of these themes as well. But just as a caveat, when you're talking about nightlives, when you're talking about leisure and fun, let's also remember that the night space itself is highly restricted on its own. And if we think of it as a space where we escape to, let's say, after long days work, then the question becomes, what are we escaping from? And that's for a lot of the men that I studied was work. And I studied mostly working class men, blue collar men in this community. And many of them are working in menial jobs, including doner kebab shops, basically small snack shops, if you will. And so it wasn't all about fun, right? I also had to get my hands dirty in the sense. And during the day, for a couple of days a week, for about 10 months, I worked in a doner kebab shop myself to get a feel of what it feels like to escape, or what is this place that we are escaping from, this work space that is so boring, repetitive, done for money, but also very tiring and very exhausting in a way. So I want to get a sense of that as well. So a chapter of the dissertation is dedicated to the workspaces itself, which also, as I mentioned earlier on, brings me to the current research that I'm doing of why I'm interested in workspaces and the work that is done by immigrants. So let's talk a little bit about leisure within the context of Islam, and this is going to be the topic that I'm going to continue talking about up until the very end, which is where I'm going to dive into methodology. So leisure itself is considered to be inherently paradoxical. What we do for fun is fun and nice, but also always brings a lot of contradictions and ambiguities, a lot of bad eyes, a lot of people that are nagging at you or telling you that what you're doing is wrong. So that's a part of the literature talks about that through Chris Rojek, who writes extensively about that. And within the context of Islam, the understanding is that your leisure time, your fun time, should really be dedicated for God, for pious practices, for piety purposes. So here's a quotation from Gerhard Böwering, who writes about leisure within the context of Islam and time within the context of Islam. And he argues that there is no place in the Quran, the holy book, for impersonal time. God is active even in a person's sleep. Allah is the Lord of each instant. What he has determined happens. So this is sort of like a cultural, religious framing of time and leisure time as we want to think about it. And time is seen as something that is endowed on you by Allah. That's a trust that you have to take good care of. It's a blessing. It's one of the two blessings, one of them being your good health and one of them being your free time. So when I asked these questions about time and leisure time to an imam, his answer was that, yeah, time, a third of the day should be spent on work, another third should be spent with your family, and the last third, the final third, should be spent for Allah, such as coming to the mosque and attending these conversation circles, a picture of which you can see here, basically sitting with the imam, the preacher, and talking about religion, Allah, life itself as a religious devotion. So leisure time is needed, it's a bliss, it's necessary. It's not a curse, but it could easily become a curse if you're not using it in the right way. It could easily become something that attracts a lot of criticism. And that becomes very important for me because what these men do with their time, with their free time, is always under surveillance, be it from their wives, be it from their parents, be it from the imam that is expecting them at the mosque, be it from their friends who expect them to do right and not do wrong, etc. There's a lot of these eyes that are constantly watching you. So it becomes an internal voice in a sense. How should I be spending my time? Should I be spending it for, activities that please me, that activities that I find pleasurable? Should I be spending it for other activities that I may be finding less pleasurable, such as attending my family or going to the mosque? So what I'm describing here is nothing new. Of course, there's literature that considers these points that I've already mentioned. So there's a literature that talks about religious versus secular time, for example. What people do is, can we really put a dichotomy between time as a religious entity and time as a secular entity? Is it something for a consumer to seek hedonistic pursuits? Or is it a time that should be spent for religious pursuits, for pious pursuits? Can we think of alternative modes of leisure that are more religiously sensitive? Can we think of capitalism and how capitalism shapes time with an Islamic sort of twist to it? Another line of literature talks about that. And of course, when we are asking these questions, we can never take morality as a black and white. We can never think of it as a binary, because a lot of these discussions take place in between, in the gray zones. There's a lot of ambiguity and contradictions that shape how the men that I studied also, keep on discussing these things as they're moving from one space to another, as they are moving from the mosque to a coffee house, etc., and engaging in different spaces. So as mentioned, it's leisure as we understanding today, and leisure time itself is a move to escape pressure that's modernity and urbanism brings. So there are different ways that of thinking of leisure time, and here are just 4 that I'm listing that I feel capture much of what I have seen as I was doing the research. So leisure time is something that's pleasurable. It's a time for relaxation and rest. It's also a time for God and piety, but it's also a time that is just onto you, empty time, boş zaman, as the Turks call it. In Turkish, we call it boş zaman. And boş, the emptiness itself, as you could expect, has a very negative connotation to it. Something that's not filled or fulfilled by a purpose. That is the emptiness that it connotes in the sense. And as you would expect, there are a number of proverbs and sayings that describe movement and time within this context. So as I mentioned, the men that I studied in their empty time, in their boş zaman, They're moving around. And this movement is not something that is seen in a good light. So the first proverb, I'm just going to list them for your for a laugh, but they actually shape. They are a part of the cultural baggage that shapes movements. The first one basically says the shoe that wanders around much brings shit. That's what it says. That's the proverb. Çok gezen pabuç bok getirir. The second one is the same, but it just says the chicken that wanders around much brings shit back home. That's what it says basically. And these are proverbs that if you were to talk to anyone from Turkey, they would know these. These are a part of the cultural baggage. The third one basically says the person who goes out at night, and once again, this is very relevant to the research that I've done, steps on shit. So the person who goes out at night steps on shit. That's what the proverb basically says. And the last one is basically a moniker that is used to describe these kinds of people that are wandering around too much, going out too much, moving around too much. And it says it is the wanderer, the empty wanderer, and his apprentice. That's what the last one basically says. So as you can see, the emptiness of time, that boş zaman, is not something that's taken very lightly. And the cultural baggage through proverbs and sayings are just one way of thinking about all this negative stigma that's attached to it. So the men that I studied know this. They are from Turkey. They're born to Turkish parents. They have the cultural baggage. They know that spending time in an empty way, and empty being not spending it at work, at home, or at the mosque in the sense, is not something that's taken nicely. But they all do it. And that is the interesting part, right? And it's not just them. I think we can extrapolate these findings to anyone and any society, any cultural context with their complexities, of course, in place. So one of the caveats is that in Islam, it's interestingly like there's an open door for sinning. It's unlike Christianity, especially Catholicism, where being born a sinner and having to repent on a daily basis to be absolved of your sins, so you can go to heaven. It's not necessarily the case in Islam. In Islam, there's a door left for sinning, and through that movement, right, through that going out, through that engaging in spaces and places that encourage transgressive or sinful activities. So Allah loves the sinner, for the sinner would eventually repent, and Allah loves the repenting soul the most, says one of the verses in the Quran, in the Holy Book, also cited by a religious scholar later on. And I would always, like, every time I'm in cars or every time I'm in spaces with men, and we're engaging in activities that are sinful in a sense. We're drinking alcohol, for example, or we're going to a brothel, or we're gambling. Things that are like basically, there's no way that you can argue against these things that they're not sinful. Every man that I was engaging with these activities would know that. So I would ask them, like, so we all know you're sinning. We all know, you're also going to the mosque. You're also repenting. This is a part of the game that we're all playing here. So when are you going to stop sinning? When is the time going to come? And at that point, they would tell you things like, life is here to live for now. Let's get old first. Let's wait till the age of 40. Or they would tell you soon, it's going to happen soon. It's going to happen at some point. I'm going to stop this kind of life. It's going to happen soon. Some would tell you that it's going to happen after the pilgrimage that the Muslims take to Mecca, after the Hajj, basically. So they would always give you sort of like a date in the future. It's going to stop at some point. It's going to happen at some point. But for now, this is the way life is. Are they happy about it? No. But do they continue on doing it? Yes. So this brings me to the last slide, and I'm going to leave it after this, which brings us to the methodology part of this whole realm of questions, basically, baggage of questions that I've been posing so far as a part of this research. So I guess the big question is, isn't ethnography already on the move? Isn't ethnography done on the move? Aren't we as anthropologists or social scientists, but specifically anthropologists, are always going from place to place, chasing people from place to place, going to different spaces where we encounter them to do our research. And in the case of my research, which is across the border, that requires crossing the border as well. So has ethnography ever been sedentary? Has it ever been like in situation, just like locked in a place? No, it hasn't. Of course not. That's not what I'm arguing here. But ethnography, I think, has also lost a bit of a sense of its earlier days. And I'm here talking about, of course, Homer wasn't an ethnographer. The Odyssey was, but the Odyssey reads like an ethnography, a piece of fiction that is very much like an ethnography, going thousands of years. Or to Joseph Conrad, who goes to the Congo to do his research, or to the founding figures in American anthropology, to Boas, and to in British anthropology, European anthropologists like Malinowski. Aren't these, when you look at these people, these researchers, if you want to consider Homer as well as a part of that baggage, when you're thinking about them doing their research, it always involved a big journey. And my feeling is that I think anthropological research and ethnography in recent years has lost that aspect of the journey, of exploration, of expedition. Of course, here I'm not talking about, I'm not asking us to get on ships and go for months to a different land, and then walk from village to village, or get on boats to go to different, there's some anthropologists that do that, of course, but I'm talking about a sense of movement and a sense of reflection, self-reflection, but also a sense of communication that these rides, these expeditions, these journeys, and I consider my car rides with the men that I studied as part of a journey as well, where the bulk of my data was gathered, but also I learned so much from the places that we were going to, or the roads that we were walking by or driving through. I want to put Solnit, Rebecca Solnit's name there as someone, an author that I enjoy reading a lot, and she does write a lot about these questions outside the context of anthropology, but I think still quite relevant to the things that we study. The idea of exploring, the idea of getting lost, the idea of just moving around, and what it really provides us with as a sense of place, as or if you want to call it data, that it's data. So another thing that I was really fascinated at when I was doing this research was the idea of the stroller, the flaneur, which is a French concept that goes back to Charles Baudelaire, his poetry, and we're talking about the brink of modernity of the century, where urban strolling became a big deal in France and in the rest of Europe. And of course, Walter Benjamin uses that and puts that concept in a scholarly realm to understand what is happening as we're moving across a city or across a space. What kind of feelings does it invoke? So this was another sort of like theoretical underlining that I always kept in mind when I was writing my dissertation. But of course, there are also other scholars like Tim Ingold, for example, who writes extensively about movement, feeling, and perception of movements. And within the context of the car, there's John Urey, sociologist, who writes about automobility, for example, and what it brings to our perception, to our understanding of space, and how it changes it. A good ethnography that was published about, I think, 10, 15 years ago was by Pascal Menaret, who has written about joyrides, basically young men getting in cars and drifting and just driving around the city of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So these are some of the things, ways in which ethnography is done, or movement has been incorporated into doing ethnography. And of course, the very idea of geography, and human geography especially, was very important to me when I was doing this research in an anthropology department, to think about phenomenology, think about what space and movement through space, or being in a space, or being in different spaces, means to people, and what are the different moral baggages that are, or the moral frames that are built around that experience. And there's a whole literature that goes back to the 60s and 50s to the philosophers, Gaston Bachelard, for example, and then to human geographers like Yi-Fu Tuan, and to Tim Cresswell, who write about that extensively, that I was always interested in reading when I was thinking about this research. And this brings me to the very final question. I'm going to leave it there. So I guess the question is, like if you want to think of what I've done as shadowing, as getting in car and just basically following men from space to space, sure, it's a part of shadowing. Shadowing also feeds off of a lot of medical institutions where an apprentice shadows a doctor to make sure that everything is by the book and he learns the tricks of the trade. So for me as well, it was the case. I was in a car spending endless hours with these men going from space to space and learning the tricks of the trade. But I would like to consider it as wandering or getting lost with them. Can this be a methodology? Can we really, in anthropology, offer this as a methodology? It sounds really messy. It sounds like all over the place. And it was when I was doing the research as well. There is no assurance that, the day is going to start at this time and it's going to end at this time. There's no assurance that people are going to invite you to hang out with them. So it takes some time to gain their trust, to be in that car, to be following them around. It takes a lot of courage as well, because oftentimes you don't know where you're going. You don't know what time you're going to come back home. So it takes a lot of flexibility and freedom. And it's a very gendered thing as well. I mean, if I was a woman researcher doing this kind of research, would I have the same level of access or safety and security, for example? These are questions that are always on the table that needs to be discussed. And if we can think of wandering as a methodology, can it be done in a structured and systematized way? And I think it can. And I think I did it eventually, but it took me some time to get it systematized and structured. Or is it always spontaneous? And maybe it is. Maybe spontaneity also brings us a lot of data. As I mentioned, my research was based on a very spontaneous encounter that I did not account for. I did not even think about that earlier on, back in 2013. So these are questions that I'm going to leave the audience with. And of course, this was a very brief overview of the research that I've done back in 2016. But I'm happy to expound on any of the parts that you want me to highlight more. And thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Oz. Now, well, the floor is open, so we have close to a dozen people watching on YouTube. You can write your comments in there or in the chat here, or using the hand function if anybody has a question about the methods that Dr. Alyanak used in his research or some of his analysis or interpretations. Let's see, just checking over there too. Anyone, any questions at the moment? Well, while that's warming up a bit, I think I'll start with one or two. I was wondering, you talk about maps in what you've written, and include some of the general maps. No, as in where's Strasbourg, where's Kiel. How do you feel that maps can help or not in the kind of work that you're doing? And similarly, to what extent, which, let's say, white French neighborhood, let's not joyride there, the police might stop us there. These are places where we can let ourselves go more easily because there's more of a permissive atmosphere, or it's already kind of designed that way. And I've got a few others, but let's just start with that if you'd like. Thanks.
Yeah, the question about maps is really a sort of like a sore spot for me, because I really want to do a lot more with them. I took classes in GIS, for example, to be able to put maps into a more to use maps in more interesting ways, to put it that way. And I guess, like, when I was doing this research, there were also a lot of these maps that I was seeing on social media of different cities, for example, that are like of people like putting words about, like, this is what qualifies this area, this is what qualifies this area. You could do it like socioeconomically, you could do it religiously, you could also do it morally. I remember the research in Beirut that Harb and Deep has done, for example, does basically that, North versus South Beirut, whereas a part of Beirut, the northern part, I don't remember exactly which one was which, but there's a different moral kind of, or a conservative sense of space in one as opposed to other. The same with research done by Sekor and Gökariksel, Ana Sekor and Banu Gökariksel, for example, juxtaposing two different cities, Konya and Istanbul. Of course, these are huge cities. Like, you know, even like, but I was always asking myself the question, is it too big what I'm doing? Two cities that I'm juxtaposing. Am I, you know, should I change the frame in a way that I just focus on a neighborhood or maybe just one part of the city and try to make sense of what's happening? But no, I want to look at it from a little further. Like, I want to use a different lens to also include the border and use the border as a way to sort of like cut what's happening in the two different sides of the border, what kinds of lives are lived in the different, and what kinds of sins are enabled, right? Like, I feel like space is the idea of sin and transgression is not just a religious term. It's also spatially shaped. That was like one of the things that I was trying to propose in this dissertation, to look at our understandings of morality and sins and transgressions from a more spatial angle. So as I said, I really wanted to do more with the GIS stuff. It just I did collect the data as well. Like, I basically came back from fieldwork with a list of 500-600 points in the city of where you know, I've encountered my interlocutors, first of all, where they live, you know, densely. So that could be one map that you could make of, you know, where the density is. I had one map, you know, in the same map, I could be able to put a different layer. Where are the mosques here? And then you would maybe try to see, does religious institutions shape our sense of the city or our socialization in the city? But I also realized that, you know, interesting things that oftentimes, because a lot of these mosques are located in outside areas that used to be deserted, like old factory areas or old warehouses, etc. These are also areas that, interestingly, were, you know, the most corrupt, if you want to put it that way, in the city. Like, that's where you would find, for example, a lot of sex workers just by the mosque. So like, these interesting juxtapositions I have the data for. I just didn't have the time and the possibility. Sometimes the infrastructure is also lacking in terms of like the layers that you want to get for the maps of, you know, we're talking about GIS, so the data has to be put in for the roads, for the maps, etc. It's still, the data is still there. I still want to do something with it. At this point, I'm basically just using like good old Google Maps or ProQuest maps, and not ProQuest, MapQuest maps, etc. And just like basically pointing out things where I find them. In the recent article that I published in City and Society, that's what I did. I mean, opportunities are really endless in terms of trying to quantify or qualify that data using GIS or other softwares, as long as you have the data. Collecting the data is really the biggest challenge here. So I think it's a possibility. I also had this like once again, this idea that I even bought the GPS for it. Like, I thought that I could use the GPS to basically track my every movement as I'm in these car rides. Where are we going? And then maybe compile all that data. What does it tell me? Like, what are the big destinations that we end up taking night after night with these men? And I realized that wasn't really happening. But you know, we live in an age where the smartphone collects all that data without us even being aware. So as researchers, we want to use it ethically. So I obviously cannot go to my interlocutors and ask them, could you share your phone data with me so I can see what you've been up to, where you've been going? But you know, maybe with the consent, I didn't include that in. I wasn't also aware that that was a thing when I was studying the research back in 2016. But you know, big companies are doing it without us even being aware. So can we do it ethically as researchers through people's consents? And if we do, does that data really tell us something that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get? These are questions that are on the table, I guess.
Yeah, fantastic. We, in the project, just to share that briefly, have been thinking about how best to map, for instance, undocumented people's spaces, and thinking whether almost like a scale of wariness, danger, or even to whether include that or not as a factor, right? Like if someone's scared of going down X street instead of Y street because there was a raid by migratory authorities just recently. And in some cases that makes sense, in some cases it doesn't, because people don't actually think about it that much, or it's not such a concern. But in other, even beyond that, like you were just saying, what's the ethics of it? Because we started realizing if we found out that, again, random example, people take X street instead of Y street, and then we publish that data, well, you just gave a roadmap to how best to find undocumented migrants and where they're going through, right? What are their best paths and things. And so that makes it rather complicated, the map idea. But one session, the next session that we're going to have is on mental maps and community-made maps. So ones that are more abstract and that show more the perception of the migrants themselves, of their spaces, right? If they talk in terms of time, do they talk in terms of distance, in terms of types of places, right? The supermarket or leisure or whatever, like you're talking about. And to kind of to continue with the same line of thought, Blanca Vasquez in our group here asks, so first, very interesting, and that it seems to her that the methodology and movement is very useful to enter into these spaces of the migrants, that you want to understand and know more about the perception of the places that they live. And here the million-dollar question of how to systematize this information, the qualitative information that you have, beyond representing the spatial movements, right? Beyond knowing where they went through, like you were saying, how do we move beyond that to something more analytical?
I think I was able to overcome that dilemma by basically framing it in a way, framing the data in a way where border and what happens on the east and west side of the border plays an important role. So, one big framing was in the article that I recently published as well, of the city right across the border, Kel, the German city across that French border, as seen as sort of like you know, they would call it the swamp, for example, in the sense like it's a place where if you go there you sink. It's a bad place. You don't want to be there. It's morally corrupt. And the reason for that is because of all the gambling alleys, as the anecdote that I shared in the beginning also, coffee houses which have slot machines, and these men go and then play endless hours in front of those slot machines and lose a lot of money. Or to brothels, etc. Brothels were less of an issue, but it was mostly gambling. Really, that was the sort of big concern for the community. But also the nightlife that attracts on the other side of the border, especially for young men who the preachers would be like, where are they? We know where they are. They're in Cale, and don't go to Cale. Come here. Come to the mosque. This is a better place for you. And it doesn't mean, once again, that it's a perception. It's not the reality. It's a feel, it's a sense of space, and maybe it's a protection mechanism as well, that where I live is okay, but over there is bad. Because a lot of bad things, if you want to call it bad, also happen in the very places where, in the very city, Strasbourg, where a lot of my interlocutors lived. If you want to go to the housing complexes, for example, of these of Strasbourg, of the banlieues, of the ghetto, if you want to put it that way, in Strasbourg, the cut is not as clear as in a big metropolitan like Paris, but still they exist, these housing complexes. That's where you find a lot of young men hanging out, empty time, right? Boş zaman, empty time, sometimes doing drugs, sometimes selling drugs, sometimes just getting in cars and just drifting around, sometimes just setting up a shisha, and rather than going, searching for jobs or going to school, etc. And of course, there are all these other systematic reasons why they are there doing what they are doing. I'm not trying to say that I'm not trying to put the blame on anyone. I think the blame should be put here on the French system of education and governance, really, more than the people, the immigrants themselves, the Turks here in this case. So you also find it in Strasbourg, but in my case, it was the way I could systematize it was I could see that every time people were talking about the German side, there was a lot of negativity associated with that side. Every time they were talking about men going, oftentimes nighttime, they knew that it was across the border, because Strasbourg was not a place except for coffee houses where they could hang out. Also, a lot of negativity is associated to them, because it's a place where no good doers go. You just go there and play cards. Even if you're not gambling, you still play cards and just spend your time for, doing nothing productive per se, is the perception. But oftentimes it was Kel. So Kel was a way for me, the two cities, neighboring cities, was a way for me to systematize the data and use it. But if I wanted to bring it a layer down and start to look at like different spaces within the city itself, then I could also start to see the mosque as an institution, the coffee house as an institution, the housing complex courtyards as a space, as an institution, the workspace as an institution. And I do highlight these also in the dissertation itself. And each of these spaces, and sometimes what kind of mosque, which mosque do you go to? What kind of coffee house do you go to? Like, you can even like bring it a layer down, because it's not just one any kind of coffee house. Some of them are okay to go to, some of them are not. Some of them are known to be bad, some of them are known to be, run by the mafia or whatever, there's all these things, but some of them are not, etc. Some of the mosque, don't go to that mosque, those are not our people, etc. So there's also the different framings that you find within society, the community that you study, about the different spaces where you find, that you study here. So, the city layer is one layer, the border / city, I think, and within the city itself, the different spaces, it could still be systematized. It just requires a different set of data. And I do have that data. I didn't write so much about it so far, but something to think about, of course.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Oz. Do we have any other questions here in the chat? At the moment, no. I think it makes me think a lot what you're saying with the sense of spaces, right? And the construction that goes along with that. Because again, I think one of the main elements we kind of play around with Lefebvre's ideas on space, whether it's conceived and it's been made that way by some city planner, whether it's perceived and that's what people are thinking it's like, or whether it's how they're actually living it, right? Which is even a extrapolation of his ideas, which isn't exactly how he presents it always. But it's something that we're quite interested in too, looking at like the Burasel Manya, like this is Germany statement. What's permitted, what's not permitted for the migrant male in the migratory context is something that happens, I think, in many different places. In the Mexican context, we have many cases of you either work and you send your money home and you're a good worker who's sending your remittances, or you lose yourself and there are drugs and there's perdition and there's everything that the social pressures of home wouldn't even make it possible, right? This is where you can lose yourself with all the stereotypes on K too. And what I think is interesting behind that too, you brought it up already, is the systematic discrimination, lack of opportunities and everything, because one could almost think, well, it's their own fault. They go off and lose themselves in the gambling halls of Germany, when placing it in this context where, yes, the mosques are in a bunch of warehouses way out in the periphery of the city. It's almost ironic that when you do field work sometimes on migrant communities, I speak writ large maybe, the researcher feels a sense of danger sometimes too, because I'm going to a dangerous neighborhood. This is the ghetto, this is the stigmatized neighborhood. Well, what does that mean for the people living there? Like, if that's their day-to-day life, well, how do they escape it as well, right? And so I think that's really interesting to see the systematic structural reasons for why the places that are elected, like maybe also like you were saying, well, all of the excrement expressions that you mentioned too are precisely things that you don't want to have at home. So, there's a bunch of expressions too, like animals don't perform their bodily necessities where they eat, right? You go somewhere else to take care of that. You construct this permissive space elsewhere. And so even if you live in the ghetto, a stigmatized, dangerous area, well, don't do it at home. You need to go elsewhere, and that elsewhere needs to be constructed as where, and here in this context, the masculinity, the rite of passage, the whatever it is, you can take that out somewhere. And even on the other side of the border, even better. It's even further away from the family. It doesn't hate. It doesn't stigmatize your own family, right? There's a distance there that's put between the two of them. I don't know what you think about that, the construction of these spaces and how even within the communities themselves, and then how that plays off of the what's permitted, right? Almost this conceived space in both contexts. This is where the migrants can go. We'll let them have their shisha. We, in terms of some city authority somewhere, is not saying the police to check IDs every time that they come out of these areas, right? So we'll let these people have these spaces. We'll permit this in a certain way, and they themselves are going to be finding or looking for such spaces, right? So not to get
Yeah.
too macro
No,
superstructure,
but
but
that is true, and I guess two things. First, you know, it's not just that people are perceiving the other side of the border, Kel, as the polluted, space. It you know, it also makes a lot of money from pollution, right? You know, there's a reason why they go to the coffee houses on the other side of the border, because it's where they can gamble, because that's legal, because gambling is taxed heavily, and Kel, knows that. That's why there's so many gambling houses and gambling alleys in a city that's so much smaller than Strasbourg. It's a border city, and you see this in border cities oftentimes around the world, that there's always one big city and a small appendage that is like where a lot of dirty things happen. There's a reason for that. And it's done legally. It's in the context of Germany, so we're not talking about anything illegal here as well. So the construction of the city of Kel itself, as a new sort of like they called it, the men that I talked to called it Las Vegas. Like that's their impression of Kel, the young man. And it's not Las Vegas. It really is not. I haven't been to Las Vegas, but it's not what I see, Las Vegas to be. It's not the city of lights or anything. It's not that. Or they would call it like the life of the devil, this where the devil lives, etc. So there are all these metonyms, there are all these metaphors that are invoked that I used in the article that I published recently. I talk about these as a way of framing the perception of Kel itself. But within the context of Strasbourg, you're right. Like there is a sense of being pushed to the fringes, even no matter how educated you are, no matter how much money you're making, it doesn't matter. I mean, within the context of working class men, it's a lot more obvious because of all the the lack of cultural capital. Sort of becomes much. It provides a bigger, a harder entry point for them to be able to socialize in spaces, eat in restaurants, or to hang out in leisurely venues that's French hangout. Like I'm gonna give I like to be self-reflexive when I'm thinking about these things. I went there as a PhD student, a doctoral candidate. And when I was working in the doner kebab shop, the guy who wanted me to work for him, he said, but I think he did it really as, as an experiment himself. Like, let's see when I'm going to be able to break this, young white kid. That's probably what he was thinking. And I didn't break. And at some point he said, "Oh, I'm really surprised. Like, I didn't expect this from you. You actually work better than all the kids, the Turkish kids in the city." And I was like, like, what can I say? Like, I was given a task, I want to do it. I like working with you, etc. But there's this understanding that that's there. It's highly racialized. Or just to give you another example, we're in a car doing a kind of a joyride across the border with three other younger kids. I was about, how old was I? 28 or 29 when I was doing the research, I guess, or maybe 30. They're like 21, 22-year-olds. They put me in their BMW. We're going across the border, and we're passing by a nightclub, a very famous one in Germany, in Kiel, in that city, called I think this was Kiss Club, I think it was called. And I say, guys, come on, we're all young. Why don't we go in? This is what it's all about, right? Why are we just like basically stalling the car in front of it and just looking at the line and talking about the women that are in the line? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Let's just go in. And they basically, one of them just turns to me and says, "We can't." I say, "Why not? Like, we're young, we're able-bodied. We can definitely go there and communicate, with other people inside, etc." They say, "No, we cannot get in." And I say, why? The guy says, look, you can get in, but none of us can get in. And I look at myself. I basically got out of the doner kebab shop. I smell like meat, like fried meat. I look horrible. I'm exhausted. And I said, guys, like, you guys are wearing better clothes than I am. I'm dirty. I'm like, there's no way that's, it's not. He says, no, you're not getting it. He said, look at your glasses. And I was like wearing, I always wear glasses because I have to. And I just look at my glasses. They're like glasses to me. They're like, no, they're fancy glasses. That itself is a way that they can separate you from us. And the moment you're gonna open your mouth and start speaking French, they're gonna get the accent. They're gonna know that you're coming from somewhere else. That's not Turkey. That's America or somewhere. So all these layers of racialization, like I was exposed to that, basically through a joyride that ended, unhappily. We were just basically stalling the car and looking at the line that is the queue that's waiting to get into the club. So like things like these, and they live it on a daily basis. This is what being an immigrant, especially a working class immigrant, even though they're second generation, third generation kids we're talking about, still, sons to working class parents, does to you. It's not only, gives you an impression of you being the other, but it also, I think, shapes your exposure or your exploration of the space itself. You can explore it as an outsider, but there's a limit to what you can get in. I could get in, apparently, based on what they're saying, but they could not.
I find it fascinating the level of consciousness, like the auto kind of the self-reflection there, that even just seeing your glasses, right? So again, things that whether it be accent, clothes, all these different signs that will permit open doors, open spaces, right? Kind of, I suppose it kind of works with the next question from Arturo Montoya, who's a PhD candidate at El Colef, and he's working on deported Mexicans in Mexico and sort of their organization practices. He is asking, how can we adopt a multi-scale approach when you put into practice this methodology, even more particularly like looking at the legislation, the different policies that are different levels, right? You're working at different levels of the border. What's determining this? Like the nightclub, I mean, we're talking about discrimination at a very local level, but we can talk about this in other senses, right? In terms of accessing services and buying things, whether it's more permissive, whether it's easier at the local level, if there's a state or city government, if there's just the differences between countries. So, I mean, there's the political side with just the policies. There's also different scales of discrimination. How do you take into account these scales when you're thinking about something that's so local, right? We're just driving around the city.
Yeah, no, it's I think it requires a research group like yours to be able to do something like that, not just one single dissertation written by a single person. Because it's really hard to get to the level of complexity that you could get by just honing down in one frame, one focus, which in my case was very phenomenological, very human experiential, experience-based, experience of the space, experience of the moral conundrums, the moral anxieties that movement and being in different spaces brings, and the ways through which you rationalize, the ways you just say, okay, I can live with this, I have to live with this, I have to live with these contradictions. So that was the level that I wrote the dissertation from. And did I talk about the larger politics of being an immigrant or a young second generation, third generation young Turkish boy or French boy in some cases in France? I tried, but I wouldn't be able to please anyone, especially like if you were to, a political scientist or maybe a sociologist that's more interested in bigger macro issues, that approaches, that wants to know about politics of racialization or immigration, or even like politics of movement across, people moving across borders, what shapes it, what dictates it. I really did it from a very bottom up perspective, and the up was just like a basically touching barely touching that. It really wasn't possible within the length of the dissertation written and the framing of it. But I think it should be done, and and I think data is really, data is firstly easier to get when it comes to this. It just requires a different um, level of access. You need to talk to more politicians, you need to talk to more urban planners, you need to talk to more um, community activists that deal with these issues, which I didn't at all in my dissertation. Mine was really just about the men, the young men that I was hanging out with. But it's doable. But as I said, like, it's the beauty of I don't know how things are in Mexico when it comes to research projects, but having moved from the US to Europe, to from basically St. Louis to first Göttingen to Berlin, one thing I realized is a lot of things, and I mean, you were in Paris, Dr. Bruce, you know this better. A lot of these things are done very collaboratively as part of big research blocks, where people are just basically taking little chunks. Each PhD student is taking a little chunk of a bigger block, and professors have multi-million dollars sometimes not contracts, but fundings that can through which they can employ 10, 12 PhD students, candidates, each of which take a little chunk, a bite out of the big chunk. So I think that's the way. Like, that's why I enjoy actually like doing research in Europe as part of a European with other European colleagues, because I think it really is a lot more collaborative and productive. It doesn't mean that the US way of doing research is bad. It's just a difference. It just provides you a different level of data and depth, and um, yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's I mean, I can at least speak for our project, extremely difficult to also find the causal, if you want to find causal links between, well, this is because in Germany there's this legislation, in France there's this legislation, it makes it easier to go out, and like the gambling is a really easy one, right? Like the legislation is different, and then looking to see what level is permitted, if it's a question of the city can do it here, or the region, or the state, or whatever. Um, but to try to link those two together, they need to be very sort of concrete, precise things. Like we've been looking at licenses, driver's licenses, and how the state level is so important in the United States in terms of documentation. And you might have a little star on it if you're from California because you're DACA or something like that, but you still do have a driver's license. Whereas if you're from Texas, you don't have an ID. And so what do you use when you get stopped by the police, right? And trying to see that connection. I'm driving around the city, but what do I use to show that I'm allowed to do this? Is this even permitted? Um, and to continue with Arturo, he had a follow-up question about this time, well, the time-space relationship, right? So thinking about how this morally religious qualitative time, right? The time of play, of leisure, and the time that how that can be tied in, right? That what it means for this negotiation between ethics and politics. Um, I'm not sure. Maybe you want to comment a bit on that, about time and
Well,
space. It's huge.
I don't think it's mattered much of it from the context of like the French government or the German government in terms of this idea of secular versus religious time, etc. Um, at least like having lived in France and in Germany now for some time, these are not debates that I see as prominent or a part of like daily life really. Even among like my German colleagues, these are not things a lot of them are really thinking about. Maybe it's because I'm in a different milieu of people that are not caring about these questions. But within the context of immigrants, within the context of Turks, I think the question is there. Not only like within the context of like the Turkish politics and what's happening in Turkey. I think that question of religion versus like secular versus religious is, no matter how much as researchers we're so done with that question, we just don't want to hear that anymore. It still is there, uh, and despite books, dozens, hundreds of books being written about this issue, not much seems to have changed in the context of Turkey. A new government comes in, or what we had for the last 20 years, and all these questions are fired up again. For a moment, we forget about these questions because of economic prosperity or something else, or war going on, or COVID happened. Everyone just forgot about it, and bam, all of a sudden these questions just rise back up again. But these questions matter, especially for immigrants in Europe, because especially for the older generations, and I think the second generation as well adopted a lot of these values. And you see this perhaps more. Maybe it's because I live in Berlin I've been living in Berlin in the last year and a half, that Berlin is its own microcosm. It's not really representative of what's happening in other parts of Germany, and Göttingen was definitely not a place to figure out what's happening within the context of Turks, because there aren't many. But other scholars that I've spoken with have always mentioned to me that France is always a lot more, the Turkish community in France is a lot more conservative compared to Germany. Maybe it has to do with the time, the 10 or so additional years that Turks have socialized in Germany as compared to France. Maybe that's the reason, or maybe it's the level of institutionalization, or I don't really know. I really haven't done the comparative research on it, but you could definitely see the conservative tenets, not in practice, but always in discourse, coming up like very strongly. The same people that you might be out drinking with the night before, maybe the ones that are inviting you to come to the Friday prayer, which is perfectly fine. I don't find these contradictions, I don't have any moral judgment for these contradictions. I think we all deal with these contradictions. It's just that within the community, it becomes a problem, especially for men who, either end up in cases where it's just too much for the community or the family to handle. So a young man, for example, that I spoke about in that recent article I wrote, was going to Kel every night to a shisha bar, according to what his dad was saying. And one night he came back, he was on his way back from Kel back to Strasbourg. He had a car accident. And of course, he was drunk. That's what the dad says. And after that point, according to his dad, I haven't spoken to the young guy, but according to his dad, he stopped going to Kel completely. And rather than going to shisha bar across the border, started going to a shisha bar close to his home. So place hasn't changed, but what the place did to him has changed, right? Like because the shisha bar probably in Strasbourg did not have the same nightlife or the leisure, the activities that the one in Kel had. So in moments of accidents, in moments of death, in moments of misfortunes, these things definitely become the frames are or the borders, if you want to think of the border here in the very moral sense, are reified. They're solid all of a sudden, and it becomes harder to cross them or transgress them.
Great, thank you. Any other questions anyone want to ask someone? There's another question before. I think we'll just have a few more before we finish to go not too much over the 1.5 hour mark. Well, I'll ask one, see if there's anyone else, and then I've got one final one in case there's no one else to do. But the first one is a relatively simple one. So in the perception of spaces, how much did that limit in the self-consciousness that they have? And this one does go back to our project a lot too. So I'll give kind of two examples here. If this is a rich white French, rich white German, or white period neighborhood, is this a place where we don't drive, we don't go? In the same way that there was this self-consciousness, like we won't be let into that bar because they'll hear our accent, look at our clothes, they'll know who we are, right? Is there a way that this auto limits, they're already imposing their own restrictions on themselves, these men? And it kind of goes back to my question with qualifying spaces, right? These are the permissive areas, these are the places that we have perceived as where we can go and let ourselves go, right? And it's constructed some way or another through some superstructure, some shisha bars, some word of mouth, etc., and some lived reality. So how much does that get tied in with enforcement, police? So if we go there, we're going to get stopped, checked ID, they'll give us a ticket, especially if drunk driving comes up. That's kind of one of the most common things too in one of the most common ways of getting deported from the United States, if you're undocumented, is drunk driving. Because the moment that you're stopped by the police, they have a reason to check your documents and then they put you into the system. So a huge majority of people in the deportation pipeline started by driving around after having a drink. And so, for instance, there are more than a few documented instances of police cars waiting outside bars where they know Mexicans to go to, and they'll just pick them up a few meters away after they've driven away, right? Now, it's not exactly the same thing. We're not talking about deportation, but how does that same idea of enforcement and discrimination fit into how your interlocutors saw their spaces and saw their way around? And to what extent, and here's the converse side that I was surprised about in a few interviews, can this be played with? I found people who were very aware of these differences, but were actually more comfortable, especially during the day, to go to the, let's call them white conservative areas, because they would dress up in nice clothes and they would know that no one's going to bother me here because they know I'm not one of those immigrants. I'm not one of those Mexicans, Turks, because I'm well dressed. I put on my nice glasses. I go to my work. I'm in a Republican, right wing, conservative, whatever, CDU sort of leaning neighborhood. And I won't have a problem precisely because this is that kind of space. This kind of space will not be a danger to me, ironically, because it's hostile to people who would normally have my profile. So those are those questions.
Yeah. I mean, what's, in the US, you have these stop and frisks. Similar thing, there's a similar policy in France as well. And some of the people that in some of the space that I hung out, there were people that were undocumented or just had extended their stay, and then so they definitely did not leave wherever space they were at. They were living there, working there, making some side money, eating there. So there were some of these extreme cases where definitely movement was limited by their status documentation. But that is, I guess, expected to be everywhere. This is not just a French or the north side of the Mexico-U.S. border issue. This happens all across borders in Turkey. The same with Syrians, etc. So, but how the perception of space shapes movement. So a lot of the kids that I hang out with, there's a reason why I ended up finding them always in the same space. Like there were some exceptions, right? There were some that were, as you said, that actually put so much effort in how they looked, how they dressed, their facial hair, etc. They looked like a French gentleman, if you want to put it that way. Like they were definitely, the shoes that they're wearing, their pose as they're walking, etc. The French that they speak. There's also what kind of French you speak is also becomes a problem. If you're speaking the Quartier French, if you're speaking the banlieue French, which is what I guess speak a bit as well, having hung out with them long enough. I actually enjoy this very playful language. Then if you speak that and then try to do a lecture at a university, people are gonna leave the room because that's like a no. That's the bad French. That is the low class French. You don't want that. So but going back to the reason why I always end up finding them in the same restaurants, the Turkish little snack shops. There would be tables in front. They would just be sitting there after work or not working, but when their friends started gathering, smoking cigarettes, drinking tea, coffee, and just like hanging out for hours. Maybe sometimes they would say, we're running out of cigarettes. Let's get in the car, go to Kiel, go to Germany because cigarettes are cheaper there. And let's just have a ride. Let's just get some air. Let's go past that, nightclub, see who's up, can we see anyone that we know, etc. Like there's also a little bit of that, gossiping / cruising that takes place. So and then they would get back to the snack shop where we were before. We would buy a chocolate bar from the snack shop, eat it, sit, smoke cigarettes, just chat. Just there for like hours doing nothing, you know, not a place that you would necessarily want to be, but for them that's a, I guess that's a safe space for them. I think that's the reason. The same with their like housing, you know, the projects, the courtyards. That's where they have been, you know, born and raised. That's where they socialized. You know, do they not have the money to be able to go to a place, a nice French bakery, and then like sit there and hang out? I think they do, because, you know, how much are we talking about? A couple of euros. We're not talking about a, you know, we're not talking about a huge dinner where, you know, you're spending a lot of money. But I never, I mean, we talked about that nightclub adventure. I think that's telling for other contexts as well. Like why would you want to leave your safe zone if you know that you're going to be treated like not a part of the society, or you're going to be downplayed for the way you look, the way you smell, whatever they can come up with, the way you speak French, even though it's, you know, perfect, it's perfect French, they can communicate perfectly. It's just a, you know, they use some words that are definitely, you know, puts them as, you know, that are the hip hop French, that are the, you know, that's the banlieue French, and that's the French that you speak, you know, this that you speak that with your friends. And that's very vulgar sometimes, and that's very sexist sometimes. So why would you want to leave your safe space? And for some people, this might be the mosque. That we can also extrapolate this argument to people that fear so much of sinning. You know, it could be because they really don't want to live the previous life anymore. It could be because they just had a very bad experience. A friend died, or someone in the family passed away, or they want to get married and they want to put away their old life, and they say, I don't want this anymore. So what is the safe space where they are not going to be tempted to engage in activities that are transgressive or sinful? You know, sometimes they really lock themselves, like hermit life, you know, to a mosque. But you also see them after a couple of months, in some instances, going back to that old life, because how much can you lock your life, you know, yourself to a room, just like dedicating yourself to religious study? Some people do it, and kudos to them, you know, that's but many of the others don't. So I think it's a sense of safety. It's a sense of safety. And so it does shape their movements. Is it conscious? Like, is it the structure that is shaping their movement, or is it their consciousness that is shaping where they move? Because you would also see, as I mentioned, some other men that would, and sometimes they would transgressively say, you know, we're gonna go to these places, we're gonna try to get in, you know, we want to show them who we are. We, you know, there's a level of protest in a sense, and there's an entire literature on protest masculinity that basically talks about that, where you're not permitted, you still want to go in there because you want to show that, you know, you can own that place. But I think you're right about, like, the daytime is definitely more of a safer time, but also daytime is when you go to work, which requires you to take public transportation, go across town. You know, you may be working at the post office, you may be working at a restaurant, you may be working at a, you know, a French bakery, you may be working at a mostly, you know, it's more or less Turkish owned menial jobs, like doner kebab shops, construction sites, auto repair garages and shops, etc., barber shops that the majority of them work in. But you can go and get a very fancy ice cream from the fanciest ice cream store right by the big Cathedral de Strasbourg, Cathedral Notre Dame de Strasbourg, the big touristic area. You can definitely, you know, hang around with other tourists and just do what everyone else is doing. But nighttime, the places where you can go to are either French bars and restaurants. And if you don't want to be in a bar setting because of alcohol, you don't go there. But you also maybe are not interested in the kind of people that are hanging out in these places, and you're going to feel so out of space, out of place, I guess, that you don't.
Thank you. Any last questions or comments from the audience? Checking the YouTube side for the moment. All right. Well, then I think to just finish up something again, even more practical. You mentioned at the beginning of one of your articles that there are disadvantages to shadowing, right? To the kind of methodology of accompanying people, seeing their lives, and that part of it is the analytical side and the question of how to interpret the data and put it all together. Part of it is just practical, that you don't want to be, I think you wrote, the person who brought a book to a party, right?
Yeah.
And so what recommendations would you have for any of us who would like to do this right now, knowing that the same issues arise, right? Questions of comfort and intimacy, familiarity. There are questions of gender and similar backgrounds, right, that need to be negotiated, of course. But what recommendations would you have, even on just a practical nature of when you're doing the work? Like, how do you take the notes? How do you make yourself less conspicuous when you're sitting with three people and you're the one jotting down notes, right?
It takes time. I mean, when I first entered a coffee house, and Turkish coffee houses are very male dominated. By very, I mean 100% male dominated. Maybe if you're lucky, you might have a woman bartender that's serving, but that's also very, very rare. So, and the people that you're sitting in the same coffee house with are coming from a very different socioeconomic background, maybe from you, depending on who you are. For me, that was the case. Coming from a very different part of Turkey. I'm from Bursa, which is just south of Istanbul, which I would consider quite a western part. A lot of these people, especially the older generations, are coming from villages in the middle of central Anatolia, highland villages of 50, 100 people sometimes. We're talking about people that were living sometimes in the same buildings with animals that they're herding, like different backgrounds. So when I first remember like going there, think of me in the same way, the way I'm looking 5 years, it's 7 years ago, 8 years ago, maybe a little younger, just going there and then sitting at the corner of the coffee house with this, paper, pen. What else did I have on me? I mean, just regular clothes, sitting there. What happens is the whole coffee house just like whoosh, all eyes turn to you because you're a stranger. You're a guest. You're their guest. They love having guests. The moment they start knowing more about you, the moment they hear about your research, they're really interested in that. Those are all good things. Um, uh, but there's always also like a kind of a sense of being wary about what's happening. Like, what is this guy? Is he sent by the FBI, the CIA? I'm sorry. Like, is he an American agent? Right? Like all of these, or within the context of Turkey, a lot of stuff was happening. A coup almost happened in Turkey when I was doing the research. So a lot of questions started, becoming of that nature. Are you a coup supporter? Did you try to bring down our leader, etc.? And you tell them, no, I'm just a doctoral researcher that barely makes any income through my through my research, that's trying to just write a book about you guys, a dissertation about you guys. But things take time. uh, the moment when I moved into that coffee house, if I was so disheartened by like all those eyes always like surveilling me nonstop, I probably wouldn't have gone there again. And it's not a beautiful place to be at. Like everyone is smoking, you smell like you reek of cigarettes, you probably drink countless cups of tea and coffee because you want to be doing something with your hands, rather than typing, writing all the time. And you can just like keep on staring at people as if like it's not a human zoo, right? Like this is not it. This is actual reality. Like this is people's lives that you're looking at. And slowly they say, come, let's teach you the tricks of this game. Let's show you how these cards are played. Let's show you how we order this tea in a different way here, or did you hear about this? Did you read the news? Or let's just go watch a football game, or as I mentioned, let's just get you in the car and just drive around at some stage. So these things take time. If you're expecting that this kind of like this level of like, in order for someone to basically tell you get in the car, we're going to a brothel, that took me about 7 months into research of people basically trusting you that you're not going to go to their husband, their wives or families and tell them, what your husband has been doing, or you're not going to go and just like, you cannot, trust is not something that you can tell people. You just have to be persistent, and you have to just show them that you really care for them. You know, you're not there to judge them. Like, I don't care what you do, man. Like, I just want to really know why you're doing what you're doing. And that's not something that you can just like put into words. You have to get that sense, that feeling, and that really takes time. I mean, maybe even one year. I mean, I spent one solid block of a year in Strasbourg, and then I went back and forth. So in total, maybe I spent 18 months or so in the city, or in that area. And if I spent 5 years, I still wouldn't be able to tell you like the whole picture. It's not possible. But whatever you can get, whatever you can gather, and it's you know, within the time that you have, you just try to build that rapport, the famous anthropological word, right? Like that level of trust that you want to build with your interlocutors.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Oz.
I mean, logistic wise, I just forgot to tell you, of course, like
yes.
this goes without us saying that if you're recording something, everyone has to know that you're recording. Like if I'm in the car, it's really hard to take notes in the car. You don't take notes. I tell them, guys, this is impossible. I'm just gonna place my recorder right here and make sure you don't place it too close to where the motor is, because then you're not gonna be able to get the sound. Or like when you're walking, like you can't really record it. You just like either turn on your recorder for sometimes 4 hours. It's on. You're not talking, maybe for half an hour, you're not talking anything. You just hear the motor running, but it's still on. Or sometimes you just say, no, I'm not going to use any of these. I'm not going to record this. It's insane. I can't listen to like 1,000 hours of this stuff like later on. Sometimes you just like try to get the most out of the moment, maybe try to scribble a couple of notes and just go back home and then write them. It's not necessary always, but if you know, it's sometimes it really proved very useful to have those recordings with me, because then I could go back and get quotations in full, citations in full, and that was useful. Other times I just like relied on whatever I could remember and just wrote them down.
Great. Yeah, I think those are always never-ending questions for field work, right? Which the moment that someone says something that you wish you could have recorded, you can't go back in time, or you can't say it again. I'm going to record you this time, right?
You don't
So,
have to. I mean, it's really, if you can remember it and write it down and be as loyal to the spoken word as possible at there, then that's, I think, you know, interviews are of course important, but sometimes not doing a recorded interview, but like having a chat with someone and just like writing your reflections based on it, trying to remember the scene, that's also equally important.
all right, fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, that was a presentation from Dr. Oz Alyanak. Thank you again for your time, and gracias a todos y todos por su tiempo, por su interés. And we will finish the session there for today. Thank you, and all the best, Oz.
Thank you.
Take care.